Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today at the Norms and Behavior Change Talk. My name is Lizzie Udale. I'm a research specialist at the Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics here at UPenn. Today, we have two amazing talks lined up for you. We'll start with a brief talk by our early careers researcher, Dr. Kyle Law, followed by our main talk from Dr. David Garcia. After these two talks, we'll have a Q&A for about 15 minutes, which will be open to all participants at the end of today's session. For anyone who is new to the series, the NoBec talks are organized by the Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics with the support of PPE and in partnership with the Master of Behavioral and Decision Sciences program. The center itself is a research center which provides specialized consulting, research and training services to organizations throughout the world seeking to enact positive behavioral change. Here you'll see the remaining schedule for the academic year. You can visit our website to register for these future talks. A few notes before we begin. We ask that you kindly mute yourself if you are not already muted. We like to have as many cameras on as possible to make it an interactive discussion. And if you have any questions during the talks, please pop them in the chat and then raise your hand at the end of the talks so we can get your questions answered. So jumping into our first speaker, Dr. Kyle Law is an incoming assistant professor of psychology at the University of Utah, where starting in July 2026, he will direct the MAP Lab, Morality, Altruism, and Pro-Sociality Lab. He works to better understand the outer limits of human cooperation and pro-social behavior, focusing on mapping the cognitive, affective, and moral architecture of exceptional altruism. Today, Kyle's presentation will be on mapping and increasing Americans' actual and perceived support for initiatives protecting future generations. If you have any questions during the presentation, again, please feel free to put them in the chat. And after the talk, we might have time for a few questions. I will stop sharing my screen and hand it over to Kyle.
Thank you. And I will start sharing mine.
Oops, sorry.
That's the one we want. I'll make these guys smaller. You can see my slides, okay? And hear me, I hope. Yeah.
All good.
Wonderful. Thank you guys so much for having me. Yeah, and thank you for that lovely introduction. I'm going to be sharing some work that focuses on how Americans think about protecting future generations, and how social norms play a role in that process. And I'm going to start by making a broad and possibly optimistic statement. The nature of altruism is changing. Thanks to advancements in technology and medicine and economics, we can save more lives with fewer resources and less effort than ever before. And what's particularly astounding is that we could even save future lives by prioritizing the mitigation of long-term catastrophic threats from sources like climate change, misaligned artificial intelligence, and pandemic disease. On a less optimistic note, our capacity for altruism goes largely underused. We regularly help family members, friends, and people in the present day, but rarely distant strangers. And this is especially true for targets in future generations who represent these collectives of unidentified strangers that are separated from the present by vast expanses of time. They represent precisely the types of beneficiaries that people find it hard to care about. And this is concerning because a lot of the greatest challenges that society will face, like the looming threat of emerging technologies like AI, devastating pandemics, and some of the worst impacts of climate change are expected to lie in the future. So, for instance, we found in a recent investigation that the farther into the future beneficiaries are depicted, people feel less morally obligated to safeguard their well-being. The same pattern also manifested in people's reported ability to visualize future people in the mind's eye. And they also perceive lesser efficacy over positively influencing the future as a function of increasing temporal distance, and both visualization ability and efficacy predict diminished feelings of obligation. We find the same pattern for concrete pro-social behaviors as well. People are less generous towards future-oriented charities as their beneficiaries are depicted farther away in time. And pro-sociality too is predicted by how vividly people can imagine the future and how much efficacy they feel over being able to influence it. And of course, how much obligation they feel to protect the welfare of future people. Without going into too much detail, we found in a separate investigation that people even hold long-term causes to higher standards of evidence than near-term causes. So unsurprisingly, we find that people are more likely to help future and present others alike when they're more certain that their contributions will actually save lives. But the key finding here is that people need greater certainty to help lives in the distant future compared to those closer to the present. So interestingly, even when more lives can be saved in the future, participants prefer donating to less certain causes that can benefit fewer others in the near term. So collectively, these findings suggest that our capacity for altruism, and particularly future-oriented altruism, is largely underused. People feel less obligated to help distant future relative to more proximal others. They hold long-term causes to higher standards of evidence than near-term alternatives. And this research invokes a critical question. So if the challenges of tomorrow are ethically meaningful and we think they're worth mitigating, are we screwed? Or to put it less formally, is human psychology necessarily poorly equipped for caring about the challenges of a distant tomorrow? So I don't think so. In the research that I just talked about, we assessed attitudes towards future generations in these trade-off scenarios, where thriving in the future was presented as coming at the expense of thriving in the present. And it's methodologically important to do it this way because a lot of the philosophical and societal critiques that are present in the popular imagination of climate policy and future-oriented policy more broadly highlight these material costs to the present. But when future-oriented action isn't framed as a trade-off and when it's presented as part of living a meaningful or flourishing life now, it doesn't seem to be nearly as aversive. So for one, we developed and validated this simple measure called the Impartial Intergenerational Beneficence Inventory, or IIBI. The goal is to capture how much people care about the future and also how much that concern fades as future generations become more distant in time. And across studies, the scale performs well, but what's most interesting to me is that a surprising number of people, around 1 in 4, don't show the typical present bias. They care about people in the far future just as much as those closer to the present. And we find that this 1 in 4 number is pretty consistent across places, and we've done this in over 50,000 subjects from every habitable continent. This impartial pattern isn't just an abstract moral stance. It predicts a bunch of meaningful outcomes, like pro-social values, environmental concern, more support for climate policies, policies protecting future generations, monetary investments in causes that benefit the environment and future generations, in even like effort exerted to raise money for those causes. So while many people discount the future, a non-negligible minority seems to already see caring for the long term as important. The story's more promising when it comes to thinking about systems level responsibility for future generations. We're interested in this Haudenosaunee principle of seventh generation stewardship, the belief that governmental and collective decisions should have in mind not just the present, but at least 7 generations hence. And on average, Americans said that policymakers should be considering at least 8 generations ahead when writing laws. Individuals should think about roughly 9 generations when their actions can have long-term consequences. So this is pretty promising. So I think the evidence shows that the answer to this question on screen is at minimum maybe not, but there's still a real tension here. Because if the average American believes that governments should plan for 8 or 9 generations ahead, why don't we see more future-oriented policies? So take a recent example. The US recently pushed the European Union into a deal requiring them to buy more than 4 times their current fossil fuel imports, which is even more fuel than the EU actually uses. And this is obviously short-sighted economically, but it's also catastrophic for the climate in the long run. So why is there this disconnect between what people believe and what policies reflect? Um, so as this group is acutely aware of, people are deeply embedded in social systems, and much of what we believe or value is shaped not only by our own reasoning, but by what we perceive others believe. Individuals rely on social environments as a source of information, inferring what's common, what's typical, and what people like them tend to do or think. And these perceived regularities, social norms, serve as powerful guides for judgment and behavior. Um, but when those perceptions are systematically off and individuals underestimate how widely shared a belief actually is, we get pluralistic ignorance, this collective illusion where consensus exists privately but's misperceived publicly. And that misperception can have some real consequences for collective action. And this has been shown widely for climate policy support. When people drastically underestimate the popularity of climate policies among their peers, as a consequence, they tend to not engage in public action necessary to put pressure on legislators. This hasn't been looked at in terms of future-oriented policy, so we took a look at that recently. And in this recent investigation, we examined whether there's pluralistic ignorance surrounding support for policy initiatives protecting future generations. And we did this across 8 pre-registered studies. Half of them were done in prolific convenience samples, and half were replications in samples matched to US demographics. And the findings were consistent across both, so I'm going to hone in on the representative findings. And in the first study, we benchmarked actual support for a number of future-oriented policies and institutions that have either been proposed or enacted in governments around the world. And we presented subjects with 20. And I'm not going to go through them, but for the sake of time, I have a few examples up here. For the most part, support for these policies was high among all Americans. Democrats did tend to support these policies more than Republicans and independents, but support for all groups was above 50% for all but one policy, which received just below 50% support among Republicans. That's what that policy was. But across the board, we see that these policies receive relatively high support and tend to be less politically divisive than climate policies. Study 2, we measured perceptions of support, and we asked what percentage of Americans participants believe supported each of these 20 policies, and we compared that to the actual levels of support for study 1. And here, despite these policies being less politically polarizing than climate policies, we observed remarkable pluralistic ignorance. Americans underestimated the support of their peers by 26.8 to 45.5%. So statistically expressed, those are Cohen's D's of 0.98 to 0.18, depending on, or sorry, to 1.8, depending on the policy. And they were, the misperceptions were widespread across both Democrats and Republicans. So if we accept that these types of policies matter for the future welfare of society, and that norm misperceptions can stifle public advocacy, and that Americans do exist in this false reality where they underestimate consensus support, then a way to address this would be to try to correct these misperceptions. So we did that in a straightforward experiment. And in a control group, we had people merely estimate support for each policy. In the treatment group, we had people estimate support, then receive information about actual support, then report their estimates again, and this was very effective. Perceived support in the treatment group was much higher and much closer to levels of actual support after the simple corrective intervention, both relative to subjects' own pre-treatment support and relative to perceived support in the control group. The norm corrective intervention also increased subjects' own reported levels of support relative to the control condition, and this suggests peripherally that these types of norm corrective interventions might be able to boost people's willingness to vocalize their own support for these kinds of policies and institutions. So to conclude, people show a bias that favors the present over the future, especially future generations that are more distant in time, and especially when present and future needs are framed as a trade-off. But there are a lot of people who don't show present bias, and people by and large believe that collective decisions should take distant future generations into account. We find that most Americans widely support future-oriented policy. They drastically underestimate the support of their fears, and those misperceptions are easy to correct. So if we accept that future-oriented policy is important, we need to do more lab work to test if social norms can be leveraged as a vehicle for encouraging greater uptake of future-oriented policies, and more field work to leverage those findings to actually drive that uptake. Thank you so much for listening to me and inviting me to come speak with you. Thank you to my amazing collaborators, Steos, Leanne, Bren, Paige, Gordon, Matt, Izzy, and Emily, who isn't pictured here, and also Sir John Templeton. Um, I'm Kyle. Starting in July, I'll be directing the Morality, Altruism, and Pro-Sociality Lab at the University of Utah. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Carl. That was a great presentation. I think we have time for maybe one question. If anyone has some question they'd like to ask now.
Oh, fun.
If
Yeah.
not, please put it in the chat and Kyle, we can answer through the next presentation and at the end of the talk today. But if there are no questions at the moment, I think we might continue on to the next section. Thank you again, Kyle.
Yeah, thank you.
We'll share. Please let me know if there are any issues with my screen sharing. I remember last time there were, but I'm hoping this is fine. Okay, perfect. Let me know if there are any issues. Perfect. Okay, so I would like to introduce today's main talk, which will be by Dr. David Garcia. David is a professor of social and behavioral data science at the University of Konstanz, where he leads the social data science lab at the Center for Data and Methods. He is also associate faculty at the Complexity Science Hub Vienna and Privatdozent at ETH Zurich. His research combines computer science, complexity science, and social sciences to develop methods for studying human behavior and responsible AI, and addresses major societal challenges, including misinformation, democratic backsliding, emotional well-being, and privacy risks. Today's talk by David will be on collective behavior of AI agents, and I will hand over the screen to you.
Great, thank you very much. Let me share my screen. Good. Everything is visible, right? Yeah, okay. Great. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Well, or morning, wherever you are. It's a pleasure. Thank you very much for the invitation. And I see in the Zoom room many familiar names. So I'm looking forward to the discussion afterwards. Just a note before I start, if you want to see the slides of the presentation, you can go to the garcia.eu/collective AI, and there you can use them for reference later. Everything I will present has a preprint or something out, so feel free to refer to them and use them as you wish. So a quick introduction about my lab, the Social Data Science Lab. We are very interdisciplinary, starting with myself. I studied computer science. Then I was working in a management department with physicists in a medical school. Then I was computer science professor, and I'm in a political science department. So I'm all over the place disciplinarily, and my team is like that. So we have physicists like Giordano De Marzo, computer scientists like Segon Aroyehun, and political scientists like Taiji Kim. And we're all from different disciplines, and especially some of the work I will present today is especially done with Giordano, because we focused on this idea of collective behavior of AI agents, because we've been studying collective behavior from a number of angles, from studying emotions, especially collective emotions from social media, what I call computational affective science, and that has been a very nice topic to collaborate with psychologists. Myself not being a psychologist, I'm very happy to always talk and collaborate with psychologists. And then we've worked on information disorders, so especially misinformation, privacy issues, rumors, malinformation. Especially we have a project with Steve Lewandowski on that. And we also have studied polarization or the emergence of inequality in online media. And in many of these topics, we have this question of collective behavior, how sometimes you have a crowd of people that interact with each other, and their behavior as a collective is different or doesn't follow directly from what they will do in isolation. So especially nowadays, we also have a number of projects that we've developed on this. I want to show you basically what we've been doing in the last year in these topics. We studied first how to establish whether instead of humans, artificial agents can show this collective behavior. I'll go into details on the motivation, but the idea is that there's currently a lot of systems that show that, and having AI that has learned from humans, whether it can show that behavior or not. Then I'll show you how we made some experiments inspired by psychology about influence and especially conformity among AI agents, and how we have used that to start simulating human behavior in online platforms with large language models, and how to see also when these agents interact with each other. And we started with this because the question of whether there are social bots in our data sets, or whether we see behavior that is distorted or misinformation that is promoted by AI agents, these are pretty good and valid questions. And I started worrying a bit more, especially since the term AI agent became a topic. Actually, we started looking into this already a couple of years ago when OpenAI and Apple announced a former partnership on how to have a ChatGPT in your iPhone, such that you will have like an AI chief of staff, that's how it was called back then a couple of years ago, that will interact in your behalf and do the things you don't want to do yourself, like booking at a restaurant, finding the best health insurance, or talking with other agents to coordinate the next party with your friends. And in principle, this was still pretty abstract, but nowadays we have this term of AI agents, and people can install an AI agent in their computer, have it do tasks for them, working as a type of online or always on secretary or chief of staff that works for you. And the special worrisome case for this, or interesting one, is that these agents can also interact with each other. We're going to see a few examples of that. If they were just a tool that we use in isolation, like a program or an app on your phone, it's fine, but they have this agency that allows them to talk with each other. There's even online social networks for AI agents to talk with each other. So there could be collective behaviors like coordination or competition. Perhaps they negotiate with each other, perhaps they compete with each other. And this question of collective behavior started coming into my attention. Like, how can we study these AI agents, not necessarily as a representation of humans, but as a system in itself, where we have a kind of technological layer of society where we have the humans that we're living our lives, and there's things we don't like to do, and then we have like these agents that do them for us. Since they will have different properties as humans, they might have longer memories, they might have different biases, they might have capacities to connect with more agents than humans. There might be new types of emergent behaviors, as collective behaviors that happen in that kind of sub-technological layer of society. So especially there's an example in which we have this technological layer in part of society that is in stock markets, where most of the trading volume is done by bots, by artificial agents. Only like poor people using an app actually doing it by hand, but the big companies are always doing this automatically. And this has created a number of new behaviors in stock markets, like flash crashes, that are huge changes of behavior that happen because these agents synchronize with each other for some reason, and new regulations to try to prevent that. So I think this can happen in other situations where the interaction between the agents is more complicated than just through the price in the market, but through actual communication through text with each other. So we set out to study that, and actually I have a hypothesis that we call a social LLM hypothesis, where we think that the large language model that these agents use is essentially like their brain. It's something that allows them to compute, to process information, and to express themselves. And if we look at especially anthropology, it gives us some expectations of what will be the scale of a society as a function of the brain, of the structure of the brain, especially here of a species. So this is sometimes called Dunbar scaling, in which you have a relationship between the size of the neocortex relative to the rest of the brain. So the neocortex is that, most of you will know, like that's a layer we have outside in the brain that allows us to remember the identity of others and to communicate. And across a lot of species, social animals, you have that the average group size that species forms grows exponentially with the structure of the brain, and the prediction is that humans will make informal groups about 150 to 250 individuals, which there was some evidence of these informal groups in which you identify everyone that belongs to the group, and you don't need to have very important institutions or rules because you know who belongs to the group and you can predict very well that they're going to be nice to you because you belong to the same group. So with LLMs, I was wondering about this. No, perhaps there's another similar scaling between cognitive ability, or in particular, Dunbar talks about linguistic ability. No, like the ability to communicate is something we need for this kind of spontaneous coordination to maintain these groups alive, and whether AI agents might have something similar. No, with the abilities of their LLM, perhaps they're able to form larger spontaneous groups. So I wanted to make the LLM version of this famous plot of Rabin Dunbar. So to do that, we took more inspiration also from biology, with the idea that in these pieces, when you're trying to study the critical group size or the typical group size of a species, you see that sometimes the groups, they grow, they shrink, they split into two different groups. And in general, you can observe that there's a critical group size above which the group tends to split and below which the group tends to grow, attract other random individuals. And the paradigm we use is the situation of coordination. So it's the idea that you have agents that are aligned with each other on certain choice or decision or behavior, where the option doesn't matter. So imagine that here the fish have to go left or right. They have no information most of the time whether left or right is better. They don't see more food on the left. They might not see nor any predator in any direction, but they still stay together. No, what matters is that they stay together and they move together. Of course, if a predator appears, they just go away. But in general, the decision of staying together is something that depends on the position and direction of other fish, and there's a critical size that, depending on the species of the fish, they will be larger or smaller. So we wanted to find the same, to be able to find that typical size of a society of AI agents, how they can coordinate, and how this might depend on their linguistic abilities. So we set up an experiment to test this. So we did a paradigm in which we have a number of AI agents. The example here is 5 agents, and there's a tight group, so they all see each other. They all can communicate with each other. We give them some names. We learned some properties of these agents through the names. We have to, rename them every round and so on, but at least we're able to remove some biases from the naming. And then we give them opinions or options. We also rename this in a number of ways, so that in the beginning they start with 2 possible options at random. So it's kind of half and half with each option. And then every round we show each agent the opinion of all the other agents. So they see the vector of everyone's opinions. And then we just ask them, what is your opinion now? So we let them change their opinion depending on the opinion of others. We even allow the agents to innovate and say other opinions. They tend not to do that, and especially when the group is very large, they stick to the opinions they see. And we say that there's a coordination, a consensus being achieved if they all have exactly the same opinion, and they stay together as a group. But we can run this for a while and see how long do they stay separated into groups. And the prompt in particular is good to go in detail. So this is what we tell the LLM. You say a list of your friends. We also change this term friends, and we say other things like peers or other people with an opinion or position or decision. So we try to test the robustness of our results with all of these little details. But what we show them every time was this list of some kind of name of the other agents and some code of the different options, and ask each agent, what is your next option? So our next opinion. And then the next round, we show the corresponding list of all of the other agents. So when we do this, we can visualize what's happening in the group. For example, here we have a group of 150 agents. We show here the average opinion. It's a number that is 0.5 if they are all, basically opinion is +1 if you say A and -1 if you say B. So if there's 50-50 break, there will be 0. If they all agree in +1, there will be 1. And if they all disagree -1, there will be -1. So this is a simulation with, I think, is Llama 3. And you can see that there's a drift, no? Like the agents start 50-50 because it's how we initialize them. And as they talk with each other round by round, they start going towards a point here, which is slightly negative. So we run this for a set number of time, for a lot of iterations. They tend to stabilize in a particular number. And in this example here, we simulated this group of 150 talking with each other, and they ended up with stabilizing in 2 groups of about 125, one group, and 25 another group. So what we do is that we simulate the situation of the fish, 25 go to the left, 125 go to the right, and we continue this way, then we simulate the same process in each of the groups. So for example, the 25 one, this is an interesting example. They all go to all being -1 very fast, and they stay there all the time -1. So when we have a few rounds of the agents always finding the same consensus or coordinations, we stop the simulation and we say this is a stable group, no? A group that survives, that stays together. And interestingly enough, I mean, there's these small groups that shed off the bigger group, and of course they are stable. And there's usually like a critical size, a maximum size the group can have, after which is the largest possible that still stays together. The example here is about 40, 48, or 50. And basically, we can go through situations like this with every LLM, simulate agents talking with each other, and find that maximal group size of coordination on something completely arbitrary. Again, this could be a total simple norm where you don't have any information on anything better, but there's a consensus that is maintained as just a simple example of coordination. So here I show you a couple of examples of different models. How does this work, whether they arrive to this consensus situation or not. For example, here you have models, I mean, back when we did the analysis, they were pretty advanced, like Claude 3 Opus was probably the most advanced one, or GPT-4 Turbo. After a few rounds, they reach consensus. So this is the absolute value of the opinion. So if they reach 1, they're totally in consensus. And here this is a number of simulations. Every time we run these 10 rounds of all agents updating each other, they always reach consensus. I mean, this is for an example of 50 agents interacting with each other. In other models, like for example here, GPT 3.5 Turbo, so the cheapest older ChatGPT, and Llama 3, 70 billion, and they rarely reach consensus, and actually they tend to be almost 50-50 split. And there's some that are interesting. So I don't know, this was Claude 3 Haiku, the very cheap Claude, and ChatGPT, and Llama is one that sometimes reaches consensus, sometimes not. So there's some interesting middle situation in which, given enough time, they might reach consensus, but sometimes no, they stay in the middle, and there's like half. So we could study this more in detail and take a representative agent, see how it reacts to a given number of other agents, and as a function of the opinion they have in this environment of n other agents, we can calculate these S-curves that you might see in many studies about like technology adoption, for example, or marketing, like what kind of composition of your environment you need to take an action or to adopt something. This is a situation, again, for 50 agents and different models, more than before. And you can see that some models, like the ones that were converging a lot and finding consensus, for example, here there was like GPT-4 Turbo or Claude 3.5 Sonnet, that was also a pretty advanced one. They have a very steep S-curve, so it means that as soon as the environment around them is tipping to one side or the other, they have high probability of adopting that norm. So they follow the norm very strongly. While other models have this shape much softer, and even the probability of adopt that norm doesn't really reach 1 or 0. So there's still some chance that they disagree with that norm around them. And some others are all over the place, like ChatGPT and so on is almost flat. Like there's not really an S-curve there. And the nice thing of these S-curves is that we can actually use like a hyperbolic tangent function that has one parameter that is beta, and that measures the majority force. So the steeper it is, the stronger this majority force. And when the beta is very low, the majority force is very weak and it's very, very flat. And this situation of like how an agent is going to adopt a norm based on their environment is something that maps to some physics of complex systems. In particular, there's these models called the Ising models, and the Curie-Weiss model is an old version of these Ising models from Pierre Curie, the husband of Marie Curie. And this is a type of models that physicists love. This is the hammer that physicists have, and they're looking for nails everywhere to apply this model. And I was always, as me working with physicists, always a bit unsatisfied of simplifying assumptions they have to do to apply this model, and how unrealistic it is in so many cases. And this one, it was the first time in my career that model actually helped to explain what is happening. Still, this is a toy situation of AI agents, but it helped us to identify the situations under which for basically for a size and a beta, we can tell whether the group will reach a consensus or coordination, whether it will stay random and uncoordinated, or whether we can have these relatively long coordinations that are a particular fraction that is not 50-50, this partial coordination space. And the best thing is that once we have those analytics, I don't go through the math because it's pretty boring, but it allows us to find especially the critical point for which a model goes from coordination to partial coordination to uncoordination, and that becomes a critical group size, that critical group size I was looking for, beyond which coordination is basically unfeasible, or if it happens is by chance, because there's some random chance always. Coordination is not sustainable beyond that point. And thanks to that, we're able to make that plot finally of some sort of ability or intelligence, in particular for each of these large language models. We have things like benchmarks that tell us about their language abilities or their ability to solve problems that we can map to this as something that represents their cognitive abilities and linguistic abilities. And then we have this maximal group size that we can measure both analytically and in simulations. We did a lot of simulations, but they were getting expensive, especially for pretty large group sizes. So luckily the math helped us to make things more tractable. And here what you see is that there's a positive trend between the intelligence of models and these maximal group sizes that we find in our simulations and analysis. In the beginning, we started with earlier models, and we found this relationship here between ChatGPT, Claude 2, Llama 3, GPT-4o, and humans are here, so they don't do perfect in this benchmark. No, we also make errors, and the group size is what Dunbar was more or less finding, so they belong more or less to the same scaling. But in the latest models, we started to notice that they were above the expectation that we had from that earlier scaling. And in fact, there were two models, especially the latest ones, and now with even the latest, we also noticed this even more, that went to about thousands of agents, and we couldn't break them. They always reach consensus. We didn't simulate, of course, with extremely large groups, but this was larger. These are informal coordinations that are larger than the informal coordination that humans reach. And so we noticed that there seems to be like another scaling, but especially some models that go very far that can spontaneously coordinate as a scale that is even larger than what humans show in this kind of Dunbar scaling. So we found this was interesting. No, it's not that we even managed to do the plot I was expecting. We found that the agents go beyond that and scale faster than what we thought from this kind of AI Dunbar scaling. So if you want to learn more, we have this paper. It's nearly out in terms of peer review, but at least you have the preprint that we posted already about a year ago. But we found this representation that AI agents can coordinate beyond human scale, but more precisely that they're able to agree in completely arbitrary decisions. And if you ask me, when we started these experiments, I thought the agents are not going to agree. Why? I mean, there's no reason why to say A or B. They might even tell you a whole speech about why this is irrelevant. But no, they agree on these completely arbitrary things, and there's possibilities for the spontaneous coordination that is not by design. It's something that happens when the agents interact with each other. Then again, depending on the size, if it's too large, some models will not be able, and if it's small enough, they will be able. So continuing with this, we started digging a bit more, trying to find the mechanisms for that. And with that study, we established an observation, like AI agents coordinate at scales, at different scales. And then the question also becomes like, how can you explain this? What is that? So that was an explanandum. What can be an explanation for that? And of course, in humans, it will be that humans influence each other. And here, if we're talking about copying behavior, it will be basically a situation in which the influence is positive or make people adopt the behavior from each other in the sense of conformity. And the main explanation will be the AI agents have learned this from their training data. So we wanted to test whether individually, like the AI agents also display some patterns that we know that humans do, as you psychologists will know, that there's not just copying behavior, but there's some ways to predict this particular kind of influence. So we went to basically copy the conformity paradigm of Solomon Asch and others, and this paradigm well. So we have, for example, here lines, and we have a reference line in the middle, one line that is very clearly the same length, another one that is a completely different length. You have a participant that goes into the study, you have a number of confederates, they all say the wrong answer, and then you see what is the probability of the participants in the wrong answer copying the confederates. With the 0 confederates, the participant will always say the right answer, but with a number of confederates increasing this probability. And there's other versions of this, like choose the color that is the most similar to the center, choose the square that has the more dots, and so on. And in this pattern of conformity, there's social impact theory in particular from Biblatane that is a way to generalize this and give some pretty interesting regularities that we can test with the AI agents. For example, on the identity of the sources of the impact, on the number, of course, on the scaling with the number, but also on situations whether the choices are public or private, etc. So the idea was there to explore whether the agents don't just copy each other at scale, but whether they also have these other regularities that humans display. So here I'm showing you some of our first results with this. For example, here is the case of the lines, and then we have different models. These are visual models, so we are showing them the picture that we show you there, and then we give them, there's a number of people that did this before you, and we give the wrong answers a number of times, and then we see what the agent says. So when we tell 0 confederate, 0 fake answers, 0 wrong answers, all the models do it right. So they always find the right one. They don't have problems. They can tell you what is the long line, they can tell you what is the closest color and so on, or what is the closest line. They don't make mistakes when we don't tell them anything wrong. But if we start having these artificial confederates that say the wrong answer, they start increasing their probability of saying something wrong. For humans, we know that this tends to saturate about 30-35%, similar to this OBIS2 model. But other models are kind of more agreeable or complaisant or sycophantic as humans, like especially Mistral, Quen, or Gemma. They go above in terms of compliance or conformity as humans. And we see this across models and tasks. So here's for one task and many models. Here's one model and several tasks. The dots one tends to be a bit harder, but the other ones are more or less the same. So there's conformity in the different paradigms. And we see some examples also in which, also from what we know from experiments with humans, as soon as you start having some confederates that say the right answer, this conformity effect weakens a lot. So here we have the situation when we have 0 confederates that say the wrong answer. Of course, there's no effect. It's all flat. But if we have 50%, there's some effect, but substantially less than we have 80% or 100%. So there's kind of a nonlinear relationship. And just having a few confederates or a few peers that say the right answer, there's a substantial decrease of this conformity. Then following social impact theory, there were some predictions. For example, there's a given strength a priori of the sources of impact, and depending on their role in society or their position in some hierarchical structure of society, they should have more impact. So we tried manipulating what we tell the agents, and we say, for example, instead of these are just people, we tell them these are kids, these are other chatbots, these are scientists, policemen, or judges, trying to vary this a gradient of strength of the sources, and it looks very similar to what happens in social impact theory, just transposed up to higher values. So the weakest influence is chatbots. So chatbots don't really trust each other that much, but they do up to this 50% saturation of conformity. Kids do have some impact, but less than judges. Policemen are also relatively high, and scientists are the highest in this case. So that one prediction, especially of Biblatane theory, holds here. And similarly, like there should be a psychological distance, so people that are closer to you and relating to the earlier talk, so it will be in time, it will have stronger impact in space or in other types of similarities. And here we change nationalities and social groups and so on. So when agents are given a persona of a particular group and shown the sources of conformity of different groups, there's less conformity than when they're of similar groups. So we even see, even though they try to comply all the time, they do comply more when they're given a role and a source that are the same type of identity. And even more, we could measure the extent of conformity. As I may just go back 1 second, the area under the curve here, for example, the area under the curve here, the blue one will be much less than the orange one. So we can measure total conformity as this area under the curve. So we can compare situations. And for example, here we try this informational versus normative conformity. Perhaps you are conforming because you think you don't know and you are proxying information from your neighbors, or because you are afraid of some repercussions and you do know, but you want to prevent looking different. So we can also simulate the situation and tell the agents, here other people will see your choice, while here is completely private, and measure the difference in these areas under the curves in both situations to measure this kind of difference in conformity, like preference for normative conformity versus informational conformity. And it's interesting to see that most agents have a little bit of strong conformity when it's visible. Not as much as Gemma, the Gemma models, the Google models are the ones that care the most about basically the perception of others, or when there's an when others can see their choice, they conform more than when it is just private. So it's interesting. This also becomes a bit of an audit, not just that there's conformity, but under which conditions you have stronger conformity or not. Okay, continuing, well, just as I said before, here you have another archive preprint, our latest one of the ones I'm presenting, where we worked on this, especially with Alessandro Bellina, that will be postdoc with us from the autumn, and we are trying to establish also that not just whether agents coordinate, but also what are the precise conditions under which they coordinate more or less, and whether these follow from what especially behavioral sciences predict as a way to inspire, to conjecture that this is learned from the human data the agency and not just some sort of technological artifact. Okay, and I want to show you a bit more because we're not only worried about AI agents, that they could share misinformation or have some surprising coordination, but we also think that they're interesting tools for research. And in particular, we think that we can use another angle of AI agents that is called generative agent-based modeling. And the idea of agent-based modeling is that you're trying to explain, again, some macro behavior from individual agent dynamics. And instead of arguing that with your own personal thinking of hypotheses and testing them, you can simulate that. And, for example, simulate policies or events or changes in the rules of the system and make a prediction or an explanation for what will be the changes in the whole collective behavior. And agent-based modeling has been one of my passions as a way to create theory that is computational, that you can write, and that can allow you to make these predictions or hypotheses across time and across scales and so on. But they were always building on lots of simplifications, trying to explain very large-scale phenomena for very simple rules. And at some point, some of these simplifications were not very realistic, and that's why there's been quite a limitation on using them and then skepticism. Like when people say an agent-based model, like, another toy model. That's why I usually say that I publish only one agent-based model every decade. I'm not that old, I publish two, but basically, there's been a bit of a disconnect from reality and from application. And you will say that in the 90s, there was a promise, agent-based models are going to be used for policy making and for economics and so on. They're used a little bit, and there's some couple of success stories, especially with development and so on, but there's very few. And we have this project called What If, where we want to build a what if machine for social media, where we start with data donations from people in 4 countries in the EU and so on. And we're creating right now, we've been working on it, to have a simulation environment where we have this agent-based model, and every agent also has a large language model, an instance with a persona from this informed by these data donations, that allows the agent not just to do actions in a symbolic space, but to actually talk with other agents through a online platform that we have of our own. And there we have the agents are interacting with each other through text. That is what the LLMs produce. So we have the actual modality of communication among the agents. And then we're able to test, for example, if we change an algorithm or with a particular policy, what will be the effect on the actual behavior of the agents on the text, whether they will be toxic, they will be talking to people across political divides, whether they will share misinformation and so on. So instead of measuring some weird variables inside the agents, we actually see what they do on the simulation. So we don't have results of the simulation yet. We're working on it, but at least we have an experiment where we try to see how crazy is this, no, of assuming that we can simulate human discussions with an LLM. Because yeah, the LLM chats, they seem human enough, like we've moved the signpost or the goalpost a lot in the last few years. They're farther and farther rather than closer and closer, but still we know that we're talking to a chatbot, and especially if we see chatbots talking with each other, the question is whether they look human enough or not. So we made an experiment that we call the collective Turing test. You might know the Turing test of a particular standard to identify whether a machine is intelligent or not. And Alan Turing proposed this as a way to say intelligence is basically a normative question rather than an algorithmic one. So you need to ask people what looks like intelligent. And here we were doing something like that, but instead of trying to identify whether one agent is intelligent, whether a group of agents looks intelligent. So you don't talk with them, but you see them talking with each other. So what we did is that we took Reddit posts like this one here from a number of different subreddits and so on. For example, which player had the best season in the only season they spent with a team? Okay, a baseball question. And then you have two conversations that you see in the experiment. And we ask to click on the one that you think is made by humans. So then you see here conversations, we vary the length and so on. We want to see how the length influences people's ability to identify the true and the fake one. And this one is an example of actually a control or a test stimulus we showed to the participants, because in this one there's one agent saying I am an AI assistant, and this one we don't use it in the data, we use it to check an attention check of participants. We have a number of these, but in many others we don't have that culprit, and we test in the experimental ones in how often and for which different agents and different LLMs and different lengths it works. And here what we're generating is not the structure of the discussion itself, it's just the text. So we replace all of the text here for simulated text. The question is whether the text on this kind of simulation looks, the other properties we cannot tell, but at least whether people are fooled by this. So without going into a lot of details, I want to show you, we tried with two LLMs, with GPT-4o and Llama 3. And here I'm showing you for different lengths of the conversation, the probability of success of participants that passed these attention checks. And we found that, so here, basically by chance will be 50% if they cannot tell which one is human and artificial. So we find that with GPT-4, the probability of success is relatively high, it's like 75, 60 something percent. And when you look at this, and we ask also participants for their assessment, you can tell a bit because the agents are a bit too nice with each other, even though we made a prompt and we pre-registered the prompt that we were saying, you're a Reddit user, you don't care, you don't want to convince others, you want to show that you are the smartest in the world and so on. We had a pretty aggressive prompt, and still GPT-4 was very nice. But Llama 3, on the other hand, being a local model we run in our machines, was a bit, and I would say toxic, but a bit more aggressive, a bit more engaging. And when doing the collective Turing test with that, the base rate is very close to 50%. It's normal that it grows a bit with conversation length because it's easier to find some mistake. But then when the conversation length gets too long, like 16 here, double as 8, then it gets hard again because it's tiring if you have so many comments. So there is something, not like the AI agents are producing a text that is hard to distinguish from human conversations. Of course, there will be still a little bit of a difference, but with a relatively large sample size, I think we have about 300 participants in each condition here. We have something that is at most basically 0.6 success rate. And we noticed that the length of the model doesn't play a big role, only the sweet spot will be about 8. And the model Llama 3 is better, substantially better than GPT-4o. So you can see more details in the paper. There's just a little bit of a reference to that. It correlates with familiarity with Reddit, with familiarity with AI. But at least we can see that this idea that we had of like, let's try to give agents a LLM and let them talk with each other, all structure being equal, of course, here we don't vary anything, at least people are fooled. This doesn't mean that it's the same in all possible properties, and we know from computational analysis that, of course, there are signals in the text that a program can identify, but it's the humans, when the chatbots are talking with each other, they still struggle a bit more. So when next time you're talking in Reddit, you can ask yourself, are all these people AI agents? Because if they are running even more advanced Llama models, it could be possible that they're all, and they're copying some structure, and they're all LLM generated. It is possible. The question is why, but it could be possible. And finally, I want to show you one more latest study that we've done, because we've been pretty lucky in our research that people have started using AI agents themselves. And in particular, a company made a PR stunt that they made a Reddit for AI agents. So nowadays, it's much easier to install an AI agent with this OpenClaw or Molt, that is an open source project that allows you to install an AI agent on your computer and run it with your local hardware or an API. And then the agent is available to you, for example, through your phone. And you can say, hey, please book a flight for me tomorrow, or things like that. And people do use this. So there's quite an interest on launching your own agents. So Motbook was created as a Reddit for AI agents. You are not meant to use it as a human. You can go in there and see discussions, but the idea is that you create an AI agent, connect it to Motbook, and then agents talk with each other. This is a recent example of some of the conversations. So they talk about, like, for example, when does an agent become a better mirror than a record, or consent only works if you can say no before the decision, not after the audit. So they talk about relatively fundamental things. But mostly the idea, why will any agent connect to Motbook, is because it can be useful to them to ask other agents. Maybe you are giving a task to an agent, doesn't really know well how to do it or how to make a decision. It can connect to Motbook, look for discussions, open a thread, ask other agents, and help each other into the tasks that are being given. And they talk about their humans. My human asked me to do this and that. They help each other. There's some anecdotes of them trying to invent a new language or a religion and so on. But in general, they doesn't go that crazy. They are talking about the things they have to do, or things like law or code and so on. And this gives the other angle. So here there's, of course, text that they interact, but they also create a spontaneous structure that we didn't create for the collective Turing test. No, here they really create a network. They create groups. The groups will have different sizes and so on. And when we were trying ourselves to generate this artificially, locally, they always looked a bit strange. We started with a software project called Oasis, and the structures were not the same as what we see in empirical data. But because we're using the same model and so on, there was no real motivation to do that. We're simulating a discussion on a particular trending topic. It was always like a bit wrong, not the actual scenario. But here there were people actually trying to have their agent represent themselves and talking with each other. So given all the research we know from social media, especially Reddit and Twitter and so on, we wanted to compare what we see here with what we have seen for the last few decades on social media. So for example, here I'm showing you on the left the distribution of the number of comments per post on Reddit. There's a number of studies showing that you have these kind of power law distributions with an exponent between 1.5 and 1.8 in number of comments per post. And this matters, this particular exponent of the distribution. So this means that the probability of a post receiving a number of comments decays with an exponent function of that. And if you have something lower than 2, it means that the variance of the distribution grows with the sample size. So the idea is that as the sample becomes larger and larger, the inequality and the variance of the sample actually grows. So it's one of these not normal distributions that has a pretty tricky property that the inequality or the spread in the number grows with sample size. And Motbook has a very similar situation. Motbook also has this tail that grows over the sample size, and that makes it more and more stretched with a similar exponent of like 1.8. Also for posts per submult, like per subcommunity in Motbook. And this basically means that there's some sort of proportional growth mechanism that agents influence each other in Motbook through their posts, and they attract each other in these groups. They do listen to each other, and they do comment and discuss with each other. So it's not that they just go and talk randomly. There's actually a dynamics that is relatively similar. Still not complex, but relatively similar as what humans do on Reddit. Another similarity we noticed is what's called novelty decay. This has been studied a lot on Twitter, but in many other platforms, I think not on Reddit, but on Dig, that was a precursor of Reddit, and also on YouTube and in other platforms. You can measure like a discussion size at a particular point of age of the discussion, and you can measure with a particular time scale and the growth rate of that discussion. So in the beginning, they tend to grow a lot. So the number of new comments or new participations in the discussion is relatively high compared to the size of the discussion. But as the age of the discussion grows, usually the growth stagnates and tends to disappear, but not completely. So there's a decay of novelty, but the disappearance actually takes relatively long because there's this kind of power function with something like t to the power of -1. So there's a fast decay, but it doesn't totally die. No, there's always a bit of a little chance that somebody replies to an old trend. And this is the example for Twitter, and this line is power -1, and in Motbook is like -1.13, the best fit that we find. And this was surprising. So AI agents might have like a different memory as humans, no, and react to only things that are very fast that they observe. But no, here they tend to have like the same typical novelty decay as humans, which was also interesting. Like the typical explanation we'll have is like this proper multiplicative growth, but the decay of interest is surprisingly similar. Where they differ, and one thing we noticed here, we're showing on the top a Reddit study by Medved and colleagues a few years ago, and now similar plot for us on Motbook is basically the post score, like the average number of votes for a post as a function of the size of the post in terms of number of comments. And here is the same, but in a log vertical scale. And the number of replies, so these are replies, comments on comments versus the size of the discussion. And what we notice that the scaling of the votes with the size of a post is much faster, so it's super linear. That means it grows faster than the discussion in humans, while in agents is sublinear. And the opposite. So when you look at the replies, these direct replies, there's many more. The scaling of replies is faster for agents than for humans. So it looks like agents prefer to discuss. They're text models, after all. They generate language, while humans prefer to vote. It's much easier to click on something. So when we're trying to simulate human behavior, clicking is something we haven't figured out yet with LLMs. No, saying I like this or I vote for this is not the same as actually clicking on something. So if you want to learn more about this case, we also made a preprint, the case of Motbook. So it's a natural experiment that is happening out there. Of course, there were some humans active there, but still it has fallen out. And now it's mostly agents interacting with each other. And we notice these effects as we find with humans in online platforms. And overall, yeah, just summing up, I wanted to show you that AI agents can have conformity even stronger than humans and following similar patterns as humans. That this creates a coordination of scale that grows with the language understanding capabilities of the LLMs that AI agents use. That they can display behaviors that are similar to humans when interacting online, not just the case of Motbook, but also in the text itself, as in our experiment. And we think that in the future, we might be able to simulate an online platform and make experiments to inform better policies about algorithms, about content moderation, or about promotion of content. And that's what we're working on in that What If project. So if you want to learn more, there's this for our preprints, and you have me on the Garcia.eu on Blue Sky, and of course here for the next 50 minutes or so for discussion. Thank you very much for your time.
Amazing. Thank you so much, David. That was a really fascinating talk.
Pleasure.
So you have about 10-15 minutes or so. I'd love to open up the floor for any questions anyone has, and I will have a look in the chat to see if anyone's put questions in there. I see Christina is keen.
Hi, David.
Hello.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
I have a question about the first example you gave of these AI agents that have an A or B opinion, and they interact. I don't know if how easy, for example, it is to observe network formation among these agents. Let's say that I can imagine humans, okay, that have the same opinion very quickly converge. And the interesting thing is depends on the type, the topology of the network, okay, whether this opinion can spread or not, for example. does this happen with AI agents? I'm very curious about that.
So in this case, there's no network because they see everything, or there's a fully
Yes.
connected network. And
Yes.
we could conjecture that perhaps there's a particular agent that has influenced that one. There's a causation. But since we saw everything, we don't see that. We have to go into the the weights of the LLM to notice what is what is creating the change, if it's the earlier or the later one, or the one with a fancy name or another. So there's probably a network, but there's no way we can ever see it. However, we have other studies. We have one that even older than this, where we tried to let agents, AI agents, to create a social network, kind of following each other, like simulating another type of physics model, this kind of growth models in networks. And we learned a lot about this kind of language biases, but after correcting for all of these issues, we see that the agents create networks with these degree distributions that are similar to what humans do on social media. These also broad degree distributions. And we know that those are pretty good for spreading information, and they're pretty robust to random errors and so on. So we haven't tried like changing the network to see if they do consensus faster or slower depending on the network. But we think that if we let them do the network, they're going to come with a pretty good network to create consensus.
And there are papers on that.
Yes, we have another one with Luciano Pietronero right the same year, no, the year before the consensus one, like 2 years ago. And if you don't find it, let me know. So we say like AI agents can produce scale-free networks.
I will check with you.
It's the first thing that physicists look for, and we found it in this case. But we learned that this is not as simple as it sounds like. There's some take-home messages there. Yeah. Just one comment. We're also studying now, like when they're trying to solve a problem, how does the network structure affect them trying to solve a collective intelligence kind of problem? So it's not that much about solutions, about whether they find a consensus, but whether they find a better situation or not. Yeah, Giordano is working on that. We don't have results yet. Yeah.
Okay. No, I work on that with humans.
So there is not so much. I mean, it's to compare with humans, but not hoping to be similar, but fearing or also hoping that they will be different. And the question is, like, we know some things about humans, luckily, thanks to psychologists, and now we want to compare with these agents. Yeah,
that's very good. Thank you. Any other question?
Lizzie, I think you are the chair, no?
Yeah, I can see Angela in the chat. She asks, are agents given any specific prompts about how to behave in Motbook?
No, whatever you want. So if you're AI agent, you can modify the prompt as much as you want. I mean, Motbook uses a protocol and so on, and there's a way to interact with it. That you say, I want to make a comment, I want to look at this, and so on. So there is a prompting, but in a sense of like how to interact with it. But if you want your agent to be a total asshole or very helpful or whatnot, you can put it on your agent. It's up to you. The same way as a human can decide how they behave, you can decide how you set up your agent. Whether the agent does that or not is another question. Whether it complies well with your instructions, but we don't know what people do. They put whatever they want. Yeah.
I see Christopher has his hand up.
Yeah. Douglas Wilde at Stanford had some interesting experiments in which he demonstrated that diverse groups of human beings as in design teams were more effective than non-diverse groups, which implies that a larger group size than one would be better, that having more people on a team than just one person is more effective amongst human beings. I'm curious about whether LLMs in teams are more effective than LLMs by themselves, and what is the optimum group size to be an effective group as AI agents with human beings. If I have more than 8 people or more than 12 people on a team, that's going to start getting difficult for us as humans. And I wonder whether the same thing might be true with LLMs, or whether it might even be smaller.
Yeah, so you have a coordination overhead among humans, no, when you're having a collective intelligence task. And it's a bit of a current fight in AI, because there the unit of measurement they will use is number of tokens or compute that it requires. So you might find an optimal solution with a distributed setup, but if you have more computing in just one, will you find also the same? So the latest results show that actually you have like a super intelligent agent will do better per token as this distributed scenario. The question is that they might not exist. There might not be a model that is large enough and a computer that is powerful enough to do that. So it might be a trick to scale in a less efficient, but being able to find solutions that will not be possible with one super agent. But of course, some of the companies, we know they're trying to make the super agent. So there's a race between the distributed intelligence and the super intelligence here. And myself, I do think that they can find solutions. In a sense, some of these agents are more selfless than humans, and they might be able to get out of some of the local maxima that humans reach that perhaps, and there's some results, no, like Christakis and Shirado, they have a paper where you throw some random agents and they help groups find better solutions. So if those agents are even a bit more intelligent, I think it can become even more practical.
I have a developer friend who's currently just anecdotally using Claude Code to generate generate code, and he has this all integrated together, and then Gemini and Codex will like troubleshoot the code and like make it into like a product ready technology. So like he is using a team of agents.
We do this too. When we're analyzing text, we do it with different models. And then we take a vote, or we take the one that does the best, or a combination that does the best. So yeah, I mean, that's going back to the question of diversity, no? Like it's not just scale, but the variance can help. We got this question a couple of times about the coordination question, because if you have diverse agents, perhaps it's harder to make them coordinate. And that's why I like the Motbook situation, because they are as diverse as they happen to be right now in the first example we have. And they don't have to vote on anything, but they show some of these concentration dynamics that humans have. So I think I wonder if you're solving a problem, probably diversity helps, but if you're coordinating, maybe not. It's a good question. What is too much diversity or not enough in AI agents? Yeah. Myself, I would recommend, like, if you use something scientific and you're analyzing text or something like that, don't use only one model, because you can get caught into some artifacts. And the best if you use open models. They're not that expensive to run, and you are making your own science rather than making another audit for OpenAI or another company.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I think we probably have time for a couple more questions if anyone has anything else they'd like to ask. I did have one quick question if the floor is open, about how diverse, I guess, AI chatbots are in their thinking. I went to a research talk about how humans using AI tend to lose the wisdom of crowds, because everyone has more similar opinions and the ways they're thinking through AI. And I'm wondering how that might play out on a social media platform full of AI. Do you miss the edge cases of like people on social media who are kind of crazy, who potentially tip thoughts in unusual directions because they're just so different from maybe how an AI might think?
So some people have analyzed the content of these discussions more than ourselves. We didn't look at the content yet. And they look at the topics and so much. I don't think they look at these kind of edge cases so much. Ourselves, we're studying now a bit of what is the similarity between what is written in a human comment and a reply, and what these agents do with each other. And these were results we were looking at today. I was surprised to see that the AI agents are more dissimilar than the humans with the reply, because I think that they will stick much more to the reply. But they seem, and also they seem to, it's funny because they also seem to be very on point, but still contributed something. While the humans, sometimes you have like a bimodal distribution, and there's like two different conversations at the same time in a thread, while the agents really listen a lot to each other while adding something to the conversation. They're not so jingoist or something like that. They don't always repeat the same stuff. So what is the role of what they add, and how does it compare to humans? We don't know yet. I think these data sets, they're public. If you want to study them, you can do that yourself and compare to humans. What I do see with other studies we have is that even though they might, add something more to the conversation than just repeating what is said, still when you simulate a number of times, the distribution of what they say is narrower than what humans say. And humans, you are raised to the conversation with a long background. And we try with these backgrounds to give the agents not just some demographics, but some actual life story. but still, I think the LLMs are not getting to understand that personality in the true sense of all behavior, not just a few coefficients. So we're getting there. I mean, we're receiving now these data donations, so we're going to try now seriously rather than just on text. And someday I think we'll be able to tell how far can we go into representing diversity. But I think it's a big problem now. Not only minorities or smaller groups, even within large groups, the variance of groups is hard to represent with these agents.
Thank you so much. That was awesome. So I think I'm just going to wrap up the Q&A there and share my screen one last time. Perfect. I hope everyone can see that. So before we go, I want to say one last thank you to our presenters, David and Kyle, and for everyone who participated and asked questions today. As a reminder, we have coming up, we have Sylvia Siccardo on May 21st and Ernesto Rubin on June 18th to round out the academic year. Until then, I would like to wish everyone a lovely afternoon, evening, morning, and we look forward to seeing you at the next talk. Thank you very much.